so much. A little bit of setup today. I have asked our illustrious assistant, Joshua, to bring out the whiteboard. We'll do some group thing today. While we're doing that, I just want to give you kind of a quick, heads up about what it's going to look like here. Thank you so much. The next few weeks as we near Advent. We will, of course, celebrate Advent that begins the last weekend of November, I believe. The 29th is that day. I'm not looking at a calendar, and we'll be looking forward to Christmas, but enter that new year, the period of waiting. Before that, we have a month in November, and before that, we have next week, the All Hallows Eve, day before All Saints Day, Halloween, where when we come to church that day, it'll be kind of a one-off. Recently, I got to go into Mexico and speak with a lot of officials on both sides of the border just about the humanitarian migration crisis and how people and churches on the ground were helping. Got to visit some churches on both sides of the border, and that was just really enlightening, really helpful. Since then, I've been just kind of sorting through everything that we learned and saw, and I'm going to bring a version of that to you next week as we kind of pray for the ministries there and just kind of join the heart for people who are hurting. At risk of over-explaining, next week is not going to be some political speech on the border or something like that. Rather, it's going to be just a very like a Christian time of word and reflection on the Christians and people who are on the ground there and who are helping and things we can learn. But, you know, if you're looking for some, political speech, go somewhere else that morning. But don't, and come here and it'll be great. After that, we've got about a month where we're going to prepare and start living into what it looks like to be open table church. And we have a month to do that before Advent kind of kicks, and it feels special anyway. And so we're just going to start turning our hearts and minds together as one towards what open table may look like here and what how it is lived out and what our, group identity, how that works its way out. And I'm very, very excited about the coming month. So that's our roadmap, always subject to change for the next few weeks. But today, we finish our Journey of Grace series together. How's that been? Is it life-changing? Are you all good and transformed? Do you have hope again? Have you learned to love again? I hope so. But no matter how it's been for you, here we are today. And it feels like lately, we've kind of been living in the pendulum, if I can, so to speak. That kind of swings between tragedy and lament on the one hand and joyous celebration on the other. We've had a lot to celebrate, but we've had a lot to mourn and grieve. But in that, I kind of want to not center the pendulum today, but really just kind of hold all of that together. Because when we lament, a lament is not whining. A lament is not despair. Lament is not how terrible this all is. Lament is a prayer directed right to God that kind of calls God to account and be like, hey, God, you need to be who you said you are, and we're going to trust in that. And we're going to keep living this way, but it is pretty hard right now. And we believe in lament and Christ and God. God's self just says, yeah, I know, I get it. And kind of lives there. And so it's not an emotional pendulum, is what I want us to know. It doesn't depend on being sufficiently happy or sufficiently in despair. But today's sermon that we've titled Thorns and Clay, or Clay and Thorns, rather, is just about life as it is, just kind of in the middle of those two things and probably with your arms stretched out. You have probably heard the phrase, right? You can't heal yourself by wounding another. You heard that before, right? Sage wisdom, right? It's like, oh, wow. Because sometimes we can try and do that, I feel like. I think that it speaks to a human response to when you are hurt, or maybe even just a creaturely response. I think of pets and dogs and animals. When you are hurt, you can become an angry, violent, or lashing out thing. I think the opposite of that phrase, you can't hurt yourself by wounding another, or heal yourself by wounding another, is by his wounds, we are healed. And it's that movement that I want to talk about today. This has all been about grace. And today's about grace, but it's about a practical grace, because grace is an experience. I jumped ahead of myself there, and I don't want to be, but when you think of stereotypical pictures of God's grace, anybody in here named Grace? No, right? Okay, just didn't want anyone to take this personally. When you think of just like God's grace, thought exercise, first image or picture that comes to your mind? First sound, first thing. Ready, go. What? Nineveh. Cool. Why Nineveh? Because of the story, right? Like, God is going to destroy Nineveh. It was a terrible place. It earned it. One dude gave one really good sermon. The town said, all right, we'll listen. And God's like, we're good. So much so that the prophet was furious. Yeah, Nineveh. Really good image of grace. What else? Yeah, the question was, when you think of the word or just the concept of God's grace, what's the first anything that comes to your mind? Picture, image, psalm, song, thing, story. Undeserving? Yes. Universal, unique, untouched.
Another story could be Samson, because God gave him his strength back.
Yes. I decided I didn't have the ink to circle all of these. Okay. I don't know that story, but maybe you can tell me sometime. Yep. Can I change it up a little bit? Because this is fun, but it could be funner. Funner is, let's not get into that right now. I don't have the whiteboard space. We'll flip it around. But yes, can you think of any bad pictures of God's grace? Yeah. Can you say something about that? You don't mean the programming language, right?
No, I mean like get what they deserve.
Right, yeah.
And it's based on what they do.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Meritocracy. Yeah. I am kind of, let's give these kind of just a thorny exterior. I feel like if it's going to be a very confusing whiteboard and sermon. What else? Bad.
Christian nationalism.
Okay. Yep. Yes. Thank God that God is gracious enough to make us better than you and more special.
Think of like cheap grace.
Cheap grace. Yeah, I mean, I'd be lying if that wasn't playing in my head, right? If you're not familiar, you can look up kind of Bonhoeffer's articulation of cheap grace and what cheap grace looks like. He gives a few paragraphs on it. I don't remember what book that comes from. Life Together or Cost of Discipleship. I don't know, but it's really great. Just do a search for cheap grace and probably gives a sermon better than I do right now.
So does abuse fall under that category as well? Or
Yeah.
well, I'm thinking of like specifically where the church has said, the abuser needs grace.
Yep. Very, very much so. Falls under that cheap grace thing. But we could turn anything manipulatively, and grace is no exception. Right? We can use grace very cheaply and very much to our own advantage or to deny accountability. Yes, and I think that's just important to know. Anything else? Here's why I think this is important, and this is where I want to start today, is because grace is something, and as a concept, and you can kind of imagine, picture God's grace. If I gave you all a sheet of paper and I said, draw God's grace on this sheet of paper, I mean, you could draw no shortage of saintly portraits of people or choirs or lights or, I don't know, anything that's Instagram ready. Right? Just to go out as a beautiful thing. But grace isn't conceptual. And grace isn't a matter of knowing. And it's not this removed thing. God's grace comes into being with creation in the sense that it becomes experienced at that moment. And grace as we know it is a practical reality. It's lived. It's experienced. It has to do with earthly existence. Because Christianity, if it is anything, is a way of being in the world. Right? Your Christianity is an ethic, but it's not an ethic. It's our way of living. It is lived out. And that is dangerous and problematic because this world draws blood. Even the world that we live in that can be nicer or safer or richer or more Christian or whatever you want to say, this world is messy and dangerous, and it hurts. Fact of life, sooner or later. Not good. So the challenge is in living with grace in this world that often bites the hand that feeds. I think the challenge is not to turn prickly or angry or harmful in our own anger, righteous or not. Rather, when I think of Jesus, the question for grace becomes then, how do we find in our very real need and woundedness something that is healing and reconciling? Because this is the dilemma. No matter how grace-filled and graceful we become, we remain firmly planted on the ground in a messy world where we will be wounded. And we are creatures. We are created beings. God's grace will never outgive our... Let me be very careful how I say this. There are things that God's grace does not do. And that's not a bug or a flaw. That's by design. And we're going to talk about that today. And we're going to talk about it using biblical themes, two of which that I really like, clay and thorns. So we're going to do some more word cloud, but first a word on biblical themes. Like, this isn't just throwing these, I'm not ripping these apart from the scripture. Like, let's just talk about clay, not the context. Again, I'm all about biblical context. The thing is, this is very contextual, a thing to do. The Bible, even in the biblical text, is working with themes all the time. There's a reason why, if you're suffering through English classes or you're enjoying English classes, your teachers will look at you time and time again, and they do it in theology class too, and they'll say, all right, now that you've suffered through this book, what are the themes that we can pick out? Right? That's the common question. And the Bible is full of this. If we opened it up and read today, the nice little story that Jesus tells about a wise man that once built his house upon the rock, right? We know that one, right? We can sing it in Sunday school. We can teach it to our children. It's a great story, but it's soaked in biblical themes, so much so that when people are hearing that story, they're not hearing a nice little story. They're thinking immediately, oh, Solomon and his temple. You're telling the story of our entire religion and this thing, and they're so keyed into this massive context that Jesus is talking about. And we're going to do the same thing with clay and thorns today. So let's start with clay. When do we first encounter clay in the biblical story? It's not long. When God breathes life into dirt on earth. So like in Genesis, clay becomes this word for what we're made of. On Ash Wednesday, when we put dust on our foreheads, it's dust you are, to dust you will return. It's this clay. It's the ground. It's our earthly stuff. It's a good image for who we are. And in those clay vessels, then, we start living. And we don't live long until we experience the pain of life. I hope you heard, Carl read earlier the story from the prophet Jeremiah, who keys into this, where he goes to the potter's house in chapter 18 and sees just an absolutely broken, ruined piece of clay that then the potter reshapes. So it is this hopeful kind of image that follows us into our Christian story very, very easily. We live life in these earthen vessels. These earthen vessels then who are weak. I read from Paul in Corinthians. Did you catch, he said, we have then this treasure, the gospel, the light of God, God's grace, in these clay jars. And when he goes on from that, the majority of this passage is we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. We're perplexed, not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. We're struck down, meaning we die, but we're not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. That's not the whole thing, but it's where I want to stop. So if we think of ourselves as whatever it would be, these like earthen vessels. I want to hang on to that. I want to do that in a minute. Sorry. We're going to audible that. The one thing we learn from all of this is that, yeah, sure, life is at work within us, but so's death. And we have this treasure, this precious whatever, be it light, love, gospel, whatever word we want or concept we want to use to understand Christ. We have that in us. But we also have death at work in us. And I guess my question is, what happens then when grace doesn't solve the problem? Like, what happens when you're full of God's grace on Sunday, but on Monday you still feel like you're going through a mental health crisis, or you still have whatever diagnosis? What happens when you still have to work through your own issues, What happens when you're so sure of God's provision, but you still don't get the job and you still have to register for benefits or these things, right? Because a lot of people experience need full up as they are on this treasure. And I think it really begged a question for me this week. Because when I read Paul talking about we have this treasure in clay jars, it brings to mind a song from Sunday school. And so my question is this treasure in clay jars, is that just another way of saying hiding it under a bushel? This little light of mine. Is the human experience of this treasure in clay jars hiding it under a bushel? Is it to our detriment? Is this bad news? I think it would be. But grace is experienced. And grace can only be experienced in this embodiment. And if it was true for us, it would be true for Jesus. But does Jesus hide the grace of God or obscure it? Is it a lesser grace? Or does Jesus help us see most fully the revealing of the grace of God? Jesus becomes this clay and kind of changes everything. Unless we misunderstand and think that Jesus is going to get out scot-free, Jesus is hurt. He is panicked. By the time he's 5, he's the target of assassination. He's a refugee. He is on the run. He's weak. He is in need. And then by the end of the story, he is in pain and tortured. And then in the crowning moment of Jesus' story with us, we have the literal crown of thorns that pierce his earthen vessel in mockery and satire and cruelty. And somehow the story flips and we dare to read it and say, in the thorns we see displayed the full glory and heart of God and God's kingdom. That's the height of God's triumph. We share in Christ's glory, but we also share in his suffering. The open table church that we want to be, that church is a Last Supper table. That open table is the Last Supper table. Christ remains the host, but we all hear the call to take up our own cross. Paul experiences this too. And we get this weird enigmatic passage in later on in 2 Corinthians. And Paul's talking about boasting and about revelations from God that other people have had and about his worth. And then he gets here where he's talking about how he could have stuff to boast about, but he says, therefore, to keep me from being too elated, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me, to keep me from being too elated or high on himself. 3 times I appealed to the Lord about this, that it would leave me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. So I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of God may dwell in me. Therefore I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities for the sake of Christ. Whenever I am weak, then I am strong. That is a dense passage with horrible implications about, hey, God, it's me, Paul, kind of writing most of the New Testament. building your church for, the foreseeable future, at least 2,000 years. Quick question. There's this satanic torment that I have to undergo that is threatening me, and I'd really like you to take that away. And God's answer is, you have my grace. What more do you need? Go do the thing. And that's terrifying and incredibly empowering in a way. We live in vessels of clay in a world of thorns. And my question is for us that I'd like us to spend some time dealing with, if I can just draw some thorns here. I want you to give name to your, not your personal, unless you want to, but where do we experience thorns? Paul doesn't say in this passage what it is. And if you ever hear a sermon or read a book that's like, here it definitively is, I would very much doubt that. People have talked about it for forever. It could have been a physical ailment, disability. It could have been like a mental torment, something he couldn't get over. Some of the more hilarious ones are thinking like a traveling companion that Paul just couldn't stand. Probably not, but fun to think about. It could be, the authorities who were hounding him and his enemies. We don't know. But Paul, for some reason, talks about this thorn in the flesh, this clay vessel, this jar that is crushed and cracked and whatever else is thorns. Where do we experience thorns? Where does this world draw blood for you? What's the danger of living? What do you have to deal with? What do you wish God would just take away? Yeah. Thorns like what? They're all thorns. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right? Almost wrote debt. I don't know what that says about me. Left debt too. Any more D words? Not that D word, but other ones? Yeah. Yep. Gonna get Kierkegaardian in here. I like it. Yes. Talk to me about that. Social norms.
Well, especially in the U.S., just like the normal way we live, just, and then trying to live a Christian life within that.
Yeah. Expectations. So,
Pressure, maybe?
Yeah, not pressure in that.
Absolutely. That's a biblical image right there. Yeah. Yep. I'm going to just stay over here.
Sickness.
Grief.
Shame.
Lust, jealousy.
I thought this whiteboard was big enough when we bought it. Sorry. Poke? Absolutely. Yeah, you have to deal with that. And we wish we didn't. It's exactly what we're talking about. We want, so here's the point, right? This is what you are. This is where you live. It's all of these things. And you live in, talk about pressure. It's as if, like all of these thorns always seem to be right outside, threatening, and they often strike when you're trying to do the things that even the church would say, like, this is how we live into God's grace, putting yourself out there, new experiences, like being places you're uncomfortable or entering into places of hurt. That's where all of this stuff is. And so the human and creaturely thing to do is to bubble, is to hide it under a bushel, is to keep that treasure on lock so that when the master comes, we can dig it back up out of the ground and say, see, I kept your treasure safe, to mix biblical stories and metaphors. The irony and the flip is, if we imagine it as light, it's through the cracks in our own vessel that allow people to see the treasure more clearly. As the vessel is cracked or damaged, you can see more clearly what is inside. Not to say that suffering and pain or this is good, or that God's out there just, throwing needles down. Because I don't think that's how God works. But God is in the redeeming business. And the world, when the world is cursed after sin enters it, and God's like, look, if you're going to take charge here, then it's not going to be the place that I wanted it to be. And thorns from the ground are front and center in that. And so the challenge is to live amongst thorns in a way that does not let our own pain become turned outward. Where it's to let where sin abounds, to let grace abound all the more. It's to not fight evil with evil. It's to not strike back when you are stricken, right? These things. That's a challenge. And it's not a new challenge. And it doesn't have to be violent. By complete coincidence, I promise I'm not going to bring stories from the Desert Fathers here every week, or the Desert Monastics. But I was talking with another priest this week, and he just brought one up, and I thought, that's exactly what I'm talking about, and I want to share it with you. There was this desert monastic community about 1,500 years ago or more. And among that community, remember we talked about their asceticism. They're like no frills, no comfort, just very simple things. Well, one of the new brothers was not living into this life as the other ones thought he should. They thought he was too comfortable. They thought he was, either too privileged or we don't know. But they went to the chief monastic among them to sort it out. Because he, if anyone had authority to speak on keeping this law and what you should do, it was him. And so they went to this abbot and they said, listen, brother whoever is not really keeping his end of the bargain. We feel like he should be doing more. We need you to come and judge him at the morning gathering. And he said, okay, I will be there. And so that morning, they're all gathering. The father's a little late, and then they see him coming, and they see that he's carrying a water jug in this earthen vessel. And he carried this clay jug with him as he kind of trods, and they just kind of watch him come. But as he gets close, they see that behind him is this trail of water that's just kind of been dripping out the whole way, leaking. And so by the time he gets there, he barely has any water left in the jug, and he's just kind of swinging it. He's light and free doing that. What he had done was he had taken a desert thorn, one of those spikes, and he had worked kind of just a hole into that jug so that the water would spill out behind him. And he gets there, and the predictable conversation happens where everyone's like Abbott, hey, thank you for bringing the water, but look, it's been spilling out behind you. There's hardly, you have to have felt this getting lighter. Just set it down. Why are you doing this? And he kind of looks behind him, and he said, oh, that And he says, I'm not worried about that. Those are my sins, but I do not see them because I have come to judge another. And in very much an echo of John 8, everyone just kind of gets up and goes back home. Focus more on themselves than on judging this other. One way the thorns of life can enlighten this treasure that we have been given, this gospel that you carry with you in that earthen vessel. Maybe that earthen vessel is very angry or very hurt, or it feels very lonely or unremarkable or kind of whatever. Fill in the blank. You know your vessel better than I do. But what I hope we do know is this, that for all of your thorns and all of your challenges and the things that we wish God would take away, maybe it's just that stuff that God can use to illuminate this gospel treasure and truth we have been given. May you not let your thorns strangle your treasure. May you not become someone who throws barbs as much as shares what we have been given from God, if God's grace is sufficient. Christ went around preaching everywhere in cities and villages and whatever, and some people followed him and a lot didn't. Rome certainly did not. And at the very end of it all, he is completely defeated. His disciples have scattered. He lost the game, but it's still in triple overtime, and they're just wailing into him. He's on a cross. He's wounded. He's beaten. He's naked, and then he is dead with this crown of thorns. Behold the kingdom of God. And it is that moment in the story, somehow, that a lost servant of thorns, a Roman centurion, looks up at Jesus in the story, sees the glory of God, and says, surely this was the Son of God, and is brought to faith in that way. May God use your gifts and beauty, and may God also use your failures and the grace that God gives you to communicate God's goodness to those around you. And for that we say amen today.